Okay, you read the title, now let's see how these exotic scout rifles match up. First on our list is the iconic MIDA multi-tool. It's a basic 200 RPM scout with a few nice features. Most importantly, it keeps your radar up while you're aiming down sights, which nicely complements that scout rifle playstyle. This helps you make sure that no one's going to flank you while you're holding down a lane. No distractions is nice, especially since you're probably going to be spending a lot of time aiming down sights with a scout rifle. But the biggest benefit here comes from its added mobility, which helps you stray faster in duels and sprint faster to get from point A to B. The 200 RPM archetype has a decent time to kill at 0.9 seconds, which requires 4 bullets. And with having an aim assist stat this high and no distractions, that's really not too hard to pull off. For simply holding down a lane, the MIDA is a pretty good basic scout rifle, but despite its really nice mobility, it's kind of hard to use in an aggressive setting. It's just way harder to actually land that 4-tap kill in closer ranges when you're dueling against SMGs, sidearms, and shotguns. Ideally, you want to have a nice secondary weapon to switch to for these engagements. The MIDA or Callus mini tool both synergize really nicely, but by themselves they're kind of weak SMGs for PvP, so you might want to pass on the exotic perk synergy and just take a gun which is actually good for closer ranges. This one pains me to rank because it was one of my favorite weapons back in Destiny 1, and I enjoyed using it quite a bit in early Destiny 2 as well. But these days it just feels outclassed by most of the other exotic scout rifle options on our list, and that's why I'm going to rank it down in the B tier. It's perhaps a little bit easier to use on a controller compared to mouse and keyboard, but not better enough for me to rank it any higher on the list. Over in PvE, the multi-tool really just doesn't offer anything that useful in terms of perks, and it's definitely hard to give up your exotic slot for something that's so mediocre, so it's going to go into the C tier. I will give it credit though for being extremely useful for jumping puzzles. I think I might have been living under a gigantic rock. I've known about Clash of Clans for years now, but honestly I had never tried it for myself. This is despite it being one of the most popular mobile games in the entire world and having many friends who play it daily. I even have a YouTuber friend with millions of subscribers who covers it as his main game. So when Supercell reached out to sponsor this video, I figured it was finally time to give this thing a shot. After spending a few minutes working through the tutorial and getting my feet wet and then building out my first base and starting to unlock all the upgrades, I think I might be hooked. I have to admit, this game is really fun and I can see why people put so many hours into it. I've always loved strategy games, especially those with elements of base defense, and Clash is easily one of the most popular ones on the planet. If you're like me and you somehow had never tried it before, the core idea is to build out your village using resources that you gain from attacking other players' villages, and also through resource generators that you build in your own base. You can then train up troops in a barracks and go on these raids against other players or against enemy AI in single player mode. I really like all the cool ways you can choose to upgrade your own base. It's up to you if you want to invest more heavily in defense, walls, troops, spells, or just resource generating upgrades. And you can strategically place all of your buildings to protect your village from invaders. If you want to give it a try for yourself, you can download it with the link in the description for free. Now let's get back to some scout rifles. Polaris Lance is actually one of my favorite guns in Destiny 2. This is probably because it was the weapon that I crutched to beat that Whisper secret mission years ago, and in PvP there's something just so satisfying about landing that perfect fist shot. I know a scout rifle isn't always the best choice, and if we're being honest, I'd probably never use it in a really important game that I just had to win. But if I was going to pick a scout rifle just for fun, it would probably be the Polaris Lance. It features a slightly better archetype than the MIDA, being a 150 RPM scout. That means that it can get a kill in just 3 headshots for a slightly faster time to kill at 0.8 seconds. These days that's really not bad for a mid to long range weapon, and it's competitive with a lot of the other weapons out there. Theoretically, you could compete with almost anyone at any range and have a fair shot at winning the duel. Well, maybe as long as you aren't in shotgun or SMG range. Of course, aiming this thing with a 20 zoom stat up close is kind of a challenge, but I do think you'll get heavily rewarded if you get good at it. These scouts on paper could be really good all-around weapons, but no one ever really dares to get good with them up close. I think that's understandable, but I'm really curious how good Polaris could be in the hands of someone who can really aim it well up close and play more aggressively with it. Anyway, that tangent aside, you can feel free to play in the spirit of the classical scout rifle player if you aren't confident in your aim up close. The lance is going to serve you really well regardless of your skill level. The exotic perk builds towards a powerful explosive shot just by landing your headshots. Once you get the 4th shot landed, you'll automatically get that extra damage on your 5th bullet. When Solar 3.0 was first released, I was really hoping for an interaction with this scorch mechanic, but alas, the burn was just a generic damage over time effect. Luckily though, this is changing in Lightfall and we'll be able to use it for any builds that call for scorch stacking. Even before the changes, it already has a decently meaningful interaction for PvP. If you 3-tap someone, you'll have 3 stacks pocketed in your Polaris Lance, which you can see by these little lights on the scope. Then if you land 2 headshots on the next player, the perfect 5th explosion will actually be enough damage to burn out low resilience players. Anyone with 6 or more resilience will survive the 2-tap though. For me personally, this one's definitely an A tier scout rifle, and so that's where I'm going to put it for PvP. I know it has a low aim assist stat on paper, but I still feel like it lands the shots pretty easily. Now over to PvE, it's an exotic scout rifle with headshot kills that explode like dragonfly, and after every few shots you'll get that perfect 5th explosion. If you hit your headshots, you'll also never have to reload the Polaris thanks to the intrinsic perk. This makes it pretty versatile for both ad clear and for some poor man's DPS on bosses whenever the special and heavy ammo is starting to run out. With all this on the table, I'm going to rank Polaris up in the A tier for PvE as well. Jade Rabbit is very similar to the Polaris Lance but without the explosions. It's a basic 150 RPM scout rifle with reasonably sticky aim assist, a clean scope that highlights targets, and an overall good stats package. The exotic perk can give you extra body shot damage after 3 headshots, so if you land a 3-tap, you can then go flick to another opponent and get your full headshot damage for just landing a body shot. Besides that, there's really not much else to say about it. It's an easy to use 150 RPM scout rifle with a nice sight. And honestly, that cleanness is a really great thing going for it. If you can land those 3 headshots reliably enough to hit your optimal time to kill with Jade better than other scout rifles, then it's a great choice. Plus, if you're landing those headshots, you won't really need to reload that often either. Even without a significant exotic perk, it's a solid gun, especially at longer ranges, and I'm going to rank it up in the A tier for PvP. Although I really wouldn't advise using this one too much in PvE. It's just a generic 150 RPM scout without much to offer. Yes, it does get a damage bonus just for purely being exotic, but otherwise it doesn't bring much to the table in terms of the perks. The only real notable benefit is that auto reloading on crit hit, but there's simply just so many better options out there for the exotic slot, so I'm going to put this one in the C tier. Once upon a time, the Skyburner's Oath was absolutely just a meme gun. Since then though, a lot has changed, and today Skyburner's is actually not that bad. It's a 150 RPM scout rifle, but it actually does a tad bit more body shot damage than all the others, and it has intrinsic explosive payload with no damage drop off. This means you're landing extra flinch damage on your opponents with every shot. That's immediately a huge plus, but there's a lot more to it. In hipfire mode, bullets follow a ballistic trajectory, kind of like a grenade launcher. These can deal some splash damage, and while there's not a whole lot to it, they also apply Scorch. As far as I can tell, all the other guns out there with the potential to apply Scorch stacks also require you to do something special to get that effect. Think about things like Incandescent, which asks you to get a kill to spread that Scorch effect. With Skyburners, all you need to do is tag someone with those mini grenade projectiles, which is quite easy to do. Albeit it's not much Scorch, just a few stacks, but it can be the difference between getting an ignition or letting your opponent live. Remember, incendiary grenades can deal 90 Scorch stacks, which is already pretty close to an ignition. And the fragment called Ember of Singeing will also give you class ability energy every time you tag someone with Scorch. So just a couple shots with Skyburners can make them go boom. Even if you don't use Scorch all that effectively, it's still damage over time, which will keep your opponent weak for an extended period of time. Part of me really wishes that it would somehow apply Scorch even while you're aiming down sights, but I can understand that would be pretty overpowered. I really struggled with choosing how to rank this one. On paper, it's pretty good. It even has 90 aim assists, which is among the best of any scout rifle. It has explosive payload, which is always helpful, and the sights are pretty clean. But for some reason, for me it just doesn't feel as easy to use as some of the other 150s that have the even lower aim assist. I'm really not sure why this is, but I struggled to get it working while recording from the video. So I'm going to rank this one in the B tier for PvP. Please let me know in the comments if you think that I'm missing something, because I'm really open to the idea of it being A tier with the other 150s, but that just really wasn't my experience while using it for the video. I even tried to make it work with Cool Guy's Caliban's build, but with the low Scorch stacks per hit, it just didn't come into play too often. For PvE, much of what I said still holds. The Scorch on hipfire is nice, but I feel like I still wouldn't go for Skyburners unless I was specifically fighting hordes of Cabal. There are just so many other ways to apply Scorch in PvE, and I don't think that using your exotic slot for that purpose is really necessary. And even if you do, I'd still probably rather get it from landing perfect fist shots with the Polaris Lance and Lightfall. The applied stacks from Skyburners are just so minimal that they'll probably never help you out all that much. In lower tier content, you're going to be killing everything way before the ignition happens, and in higher tier content, you're probably going to need that exotic slot for something else like Gallarhorn, Witherhorde, Izanagi's, or so on. Simply running the perk Incandescent on a legendary scout rifle is going to be more than enough for all of your ignition needs. So that's why I'm going to rank Skyburners in the B tier for PvE. Symmetry is a really tricky scout rifle. At base, it's just a decent 260 RPM scout. These really don't have the best kill times, but they do make up for it by having more leniency in the accuracy requirement. Besides that, Symmetry also has this alternate fire mode where it shoots out these seeking bolts at a slower RPM. I'm guessing it's somewhere around 100 rounds per minute. So ideally, you really want to be 2-tapping your opponents with this mode, otherwise your time to kill is going to be really bad. To increase the damage of the bolts, you need to land headshots in the normal mode, and after collecting 7 stacks, you'll be able to 2-tap enemy players. You can keep going and collecting more stacks than that, but just know that you're never going to be able to one-shot your opponents, so it's really not worth it to go beyond 7. With the powered up mode, Symmetry is actually quite deadly, but it only lasts for a limited amount of time after you fire that first shot, and it still does have travel time. It's a decent choice to punish those more campy playstyles, but nowadays it's really not the campers that are the biggest problems in the Crucible. I feel like in some ways it's just the wrong time for Symmetry. It could still be good, but it lacks specific counterplay to the current meta choices. The perk itself is extremely fun to use for lower stakes PvP, but I'd probably never take it into more serious content. The base gun just really isn't good enough to justify picking it despite how deadly those homing missiles can be. So despite the fun you can have on a nice spree with it, I'm going to put Symmetry in the B tier. And for PvE, well, unfortunately the exotic perk really isn't all that great. If it jolted targets, then we'd be talking, but for now it's just okay, nothing really special to write home about. So I'm going to rank it B tier for PvE as well. We've got 2 more exotic scouts on our list, and we're going to talk about the recently reintroduced Touch of Malice. This was a very memorable weapon in Destiny 1, so how does it live up to our expectations? Well, it's a rapid fire frame just like Symmetry, but it has a very different exotic perk. You get bonus damage if you're on the last bullet in the magazine at the cost of receiving damage to yourself every time you shoot. And you can also shoot infinite ammo without needing to reload. There's also the Charged with Blight perk where you can fire a giant blight at enemies after collecting headshot stacks, but that one's not really so important for PvP. Yes, it can technically one-shot, but no decent player is going to stand still long enough for you to line up that shot. So the question for PvP is whether you should accept the damage to yourself in favor of that extra outgoing damage and potentially faster time to kill. In fact, you only need to land 4 headshots with the last shot damage boost instead of the usual 5. 4-tapping someone would get you a sub 0.8 second time to kill, which would easily make Touch of Malice the most lethal scout on the list. But not so fast. You will also receive damage, so what does that mean for you? Well, I've got bad news. Even though you might be melting your opponent, they're also going to be melting you back. Unless you're standing in a Well of Radiance or a Healing Rift or have some form of healing going, it's pretty easy to accidentally kill yourself while fighting the enemy. Even if you don't directly chew through the last bit of your own health bar, you're at a minimum making it much easier for your opponent to hit their optimal time to kill. So despite it being pretty fun to shoot an unlimited supply of high damage bullets, I just don't think it's worth it in PvP. And for that reason, I'm going to rank it in the B tier. In PvE, this is a completely different story though. Having an unlimited firing scout rifle with beefy extra damage plus the blighted shot damage is pretty strong, assuming you don't accidentally kill yourself by shooting it. Luckily, we have so many ways to receive healing in PvE these days that it's not nearly as dangerous to use as compared to the Crucible. It pairs really great with Wells of Radiance and Healing Rifts. This makes it a pretty solid choice in most content provided you have some source of continuous healing. Sure, there are better exotic weapons out there for PvE, but if we're specifically comparing it against other exotic scout rifles, I feel like this one's the clear winner. So I'm going to rank this one up in the S tier. And finally, we have the Dead Man's Tale. This is the most unique scout rifle on the list from an archetype standpoint. It's the only exotic scout featuring a 120 RPM model, but it can shoot even faster from the hip. In fact, it's somewhat designed to be used from hipfire mode, and it gets a huge accuracy benefit from the catalyst. Counterintuitively, one of the most valuable things to have on a scout rifle is really good hipfire accuracy. That's because they usually have very high zooms, which makes them a little bit hard to use up close. Even though DMT kills a bit more slowly with the 120 RPM fire rate and the 1.0 time to kill, the way that the damage is delivered is what makes DMT so good. This is something that you have to understand about PvP. It's not always just about killing your opponent quickly. Sure, your gun should of course kill fast, but sometimes it's even more important that your gun can output a large amount of damage in a short period of time, and the DMT does this wonderfully well. You can easily contest any weapon on the battlefield with DMT if you utilize your cover appropriately. You have the upper hand on all hand cannons, all auto rifles, most pulse rifles, and basically all scout rifles if you just manage your engagements and your positioning well. And the best part is that you're not only lethal at long ranges. DMT's hipfire mode allows you to strafe around the map with your radar still on screen, while dealing the full damage that you'd get from the aiming down sight mode but at a faster rate of fire. This negates one of the most awkward parts of scout rifles and makes you very dangerous at basically any range. I didn't even mention the DMT's exotic perk, Cranial Spike. It used to give bonus damage, enough to even land a 2-tap. But now it just gives you extra target acquisition and range for landing headshots, and at 5 stacks it wildly ramps up the DMT's fire rate. With all this said, the Dead Man's Tale is headed straight up to the S tier for PvP. Even after the nerfs, it's still far and away the best scout rifle in the game in my books. On controller, the hipfire mode does feel a little bit less sticky, so I could see dropping down maybe a tier, but it's still a fantastic scout rifle even in just ADS mode. In PvE, living up the cowboy fantasy is pretty fun, but to get that higher RPM, you're most likely going to need to reload at least once, which makes it kind of hard to keep that perk going. Vorpal weapon on a very high impact scout is nice for dealing a bit of extra damage to bosses, but it's kind of hard to justify picking a primary exotic weapon just for boss damage when the exotic slot could be used for something else with much higher DPS. You also have some nice perk options with 4 times the charm, outlaw, and subsistence to cut down on your time reloading. But really, for PvE, it's just not all that good. Overall, for scout rifles in PvE, there are much better legendary choices out there. You can get volatile rounds on the void ones, incandescent on solar, headstone on stasis, or bolt shot on arc. And compared to the other exotic scout rifle options, I'm going to rank it in the B tier for PvE. If you get yourself a God Rolled legendary scout rifle, I'm pretty sure it's going to serve you better than any of the exotic ones really would. Up next, check out my video ranking every exotic pulse rifle in a tier list for both PvP and PvE. It's linked on screen and in the description.